Welcome to the Contracting Officer Podcast. It's not just for contracting officers. If you're anywhere in the government acquisition world, this podcast is for you. We're continuing our holiday tradition of providing a refresher of a previously released episode. Today we're talking about how the government considers you to be a small business or a large business, but there's nothing really in between. There's no mid-sized business. So here we go with what is a mid-sized business. We all kind of know what small means and what large means, but there's also mega corporations, and I think most companies fall right in between what people would call small and people call large.
Well, and what's funny is that there should be like a micro, like a startup. People say, I think the term startup probably refers to a micro, but it's like, when do you become startup versus a small versus a mid versus a large?
Micro versus small versus large versus massive versus mega versus basically a small country.
Yeah, which is possible.
So that leads us to the topic for today, which is mid-sized businesses. Before we get started with that, though,
I want to thank Dr. Claude Cable for just sharing our content on LinkedIn. He works for the Small Business Administration, and he just is sharing our podcast content because he knows it helps people. So thanks for that.
And I'll start with the FAR definition of small business. It's interesting. There is a FAR definition of small business. FAR 2.101 in the definition section. Small business is an independently owned and operated, not dominant in the field of operation in which it is bidding on government contracts, and is qualified as a small business under the criteria and size standards in 13 CFR Part 121, C FAR 19, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so not dominant in the field of operations means that they're not controlling or they're not a major influence on a national basis in the kind of business that the company does. And dominance is related to, the amount of business they do, how many employees they have, their resources, their competitive status, and whether or not they have the intellectual property where no more entrants can get in there, right?
Well, if they own like all the materials, or and the example I use this is like the Andrew Carnegie. His big thing was own the supply chain. And so the extreme example of Carnegie Steel owned the whole supply chain, and therefore they owned the whole steel industry. So that's like a super mega large business. So the opposite of that is what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Think Apple. They're somewhat dominant in their business. They're certainly not small. They're like on that small country scale as far as gross national product or revenues. Anyway, small businesses, that is defined in the FAR, but large business is not. So from the government's perspective, you're either small or you're not. And if you're not, you're large. And the trouble with that is large is not just large. There's all kinds of different types of large. And we're going to talk about that weird threshold between small and large. So to define that, Kevin, what is a mid-sized business? And we're going to talk about the threshold where you go from being a large small business to becoming a small large business. This is going to get confusing fast. I can already tell.
But the basic idea is valid. I mean, the analogy that we talk about is like, we need to know what are the wheeled vehicles that are available in the world. And we're going to say, okay, the ones that have two wheels and are a moped, those are the small businesses. Everything else is the large businesses. And that's a valid analogy of how diverse all these different large businesses are. And we try to tinker with them with the NAICS codes and stuff like that. But realistically, as a contracting officer, I did not understand what a company looked like that had just tripped the wire to be a large business.
Using the wheeled vehicle standard there, you can see a lot of comparisons between a moped, a dirt bike, a motorcycle. But as soon as you leap to a sedan or a pickup truck, there's a lot of differences, but really they're all still wheeled vehicles, or they're all still large businesses in our analogy, right? And so is also a Humvee and a tank and one of those massive mining vehicles with the tires that are 30 feet tall or however big they're. They're all large businesses, yet as soon as you get past that moped phase, you might be called a large business too. That's such a weird analogy, but I like the way it puts it in my mind good.
And the really fun part is that like a tank, it has a tread. But if you look at a tank, there are wheels inside the tank. So it's a wheeled vehicle. This is how it gets crazy in a hurry. So that's why it's just fun to talk about.
All right. Large, small businesses. What is a large, small business? So you're still a small business by the Small Business Administration rules, but you're pushing on that ceiling.
And an example would be a professional services company that has between $10 and $14 million in revenue when it's a $15 million NAICS code. Like this, the definition of a small business, and we talked about this in other episodes, definition of a small business is somebody who has an average of $15 million in revenue over the last 3 years. Well, let's say you've got 14 million. You are a large, small. But the contracting officer, the government customer, everybody just sees the SBA, they see you as small.
You're talking in that definition for this NAICS code.
Exactly, yeah.
Not,
for that one
not 15 million isn't the threshold for everything.
Correct, which, there's, let me not go down that road, or we'll end up with a 2-hour podcast.
Right. So what does a large small business look like? You may have gotten past that mom and pop shop perception. Just maybe. You may not have, because I know many small businesses that have a very professional type organization. I know many small businesses that are right on the cusp of becoming large businesses that still are run very much like the mom and pop. But if you're not past that phase, you're just getting to the point where you really need to be. Another way to look at it, large smalls may also have some type of executive team. Now, it's probably not a formal, you may have titles like president and chief operating officer and chief financial officer, but it still might be mom and pop in those roles. But your executive team, you're not siloed into specific jobs. People still are wearing a lot of hats in most cases at this large, small size. You haven't quite reached the point where you need just executive leadership.
Yeah, and a good example would be things like your proposal manager. I mean, if you're at the point where you have somebody who all they do is write proposals, their job may be proposal manager when it's when you're a small company, but it's also it's one of the things that they do. Well, when you're getting to that point where you have a proposal manager, that's all they do. They don't have other duties as assigned. Then that, and again, as a government person, I never saw the difference.
Right. If you have back office people that only have one job and never have to do anything else, you're probably getting pretty big. Another characteristic, a large small business, you may have prime contracts, whereas as a very, very small company, you were just subcontracting to the primes. You may now have your own prime contracts. You may actually have subcontractors working for you. You may not, but you may.
Yeah, and we're painting with a broad brush. And so as a large small, your size probably gives you an advantage, because think about it, you're big enough that you've got scale, you've got experience, you've got resources. You probably have a building that you may own by now. You have a good infrastructure. You've a banker that you have access to capital. So if you win a $100 million contract, you can actually fund the first 3 months. You have a really awesome website in theory. Again,
so you may have an advantage over the really small guys by this point.
Yeah, over the we'll call them the micros.
Yeah,
which basically is like a startup, right?
But there's real challenges to being a large small business, because you have to be preparing to move on to that next phase and be a large business. You're probably hitting the point where you need to hire full-time people that all they do are HR and finance and accounting and proposal management and those other things you're talking about, but you might not be making enough money to actually afford people that just do that by this point. So it's tough to be a large small business.
And honestly, that's why a lot of our Skyway members they're large smalls, is that they need a little bit of help to kind of get them through this process, but they're not ready at the point to really hire a whole bunch of people full-time that are overhead.
That's where you start needing them, is right at this large, small point, because things get harder. This is where the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the OFCCP, they have this. OFCCP. It doesn't roll off the tongue, but there's thresholds based on the number of employees, and there's some other thresholds. And the Department of Labor, same way. They judge you as a company based on numbers of employees and revenue. So at 20 employees, you have to start doing some reporting and compliance actions for the OFCCP. Not a lot, but some. When you get to 50 employees, when you trip over that line from 49 to 50, boom, all kinds of hard things are required. This is where you have to have affirmative action plans. You have to do equal employment opportunity reporting, just to start with the list of things that gets harder at 50. And then at 100 employees, there's some more things that are added on. But the point is, moving from a small business to a large business, overnight, boom, triggers compliance actions that you may not even be thinking of. So let's talk about that. Right, or even aware of. So let's talk about what happens that next day.
So the example here is going back to our professional services company, which in the one NAICS that we talked about, it's $15 million in revenue. Well, I actually talked to a guy once. He said, yeah, we tripped the large business. It was a professional services company. We tripped the large business by $60,000. And what goes through my head, went through my head is, ouch.
Yeah, because that's going to cost you more than 60 to do that.
Exactly. So he was 15.060 million in revenue.
At this point, you still feel like the same company. I mean, that guy, when he tripped that threshold, he was probably asleep at night when he tripped the threshold. But when he woke up in the morning, the rules were all different because now he's considered a large business.
And he might be big enough to be known and found and like have a brand, right? But only if you really target. We all know that there are thousands of companies that are $50, $100 million in revenue that we've never heard of. Yeah. Right. So if you really are hyper targeting and you become a large business, then you're known in your targeted area.
But most companies that have just tripped over this threshold aren't on the tip of every contracting officer's tongue when it comes to market research. Like who can do this?
Okay.
Hey, Boeing can do this. Yeah, that's a company
Exactly.
Everybody knows. But maybe not someone that now has 50 employees, or is it 15.060 in revenue? And it changes your outlook on competition.
Yeah, because your opportunities, they changed. You may have more because now you can bid on a lot of more things because you're a large business. But what I would say, you actually probably have less because you can't have fewer because you can't use the set aside anymore. You're no longer able to prime a lot of small business set aside.
Yeah, that's a weird way to look at it. Because you always could have been on everything that's full and open as a small, but you're probably in an effort to be more competitive. You're probably using those set asides to only compete against your peers and not trying to compete against really big companies. Then you wake up in the morning and you can't do that anymore. Congratulations, you're now in the full and open world. At this point, the government looks at you as a large business. You check that box. I'm a large business. So you're perceived to have all the stuff that large businesses have.
Yeah, I mean, really, you still have that small business experience. It's fresh in your past. And you probably still act like a small business because it isn't like everybody in the company, all 51 employees, suddenly says, hey, switch, we're a large business. Most of them don't know it. So your behavior didn't change that much.
Yeah, and we're going to say that's good that you're still able to act like a small company and not a big company with lots of bureaucracy and all that evil stuff. But this it can actually work against you because, like I was saying, the government may perceive you as large, but you don't have all the resources and capabilities to really be large. Or the government may still think of you as a small business. You crossed a line, but it's a very thin line. It's not like you jump from 50 employees to 5,000 employees. You jump from 49 to 50. The government may still only see you as that small company, even though you want to be seen as a big company now. And that may work against you in source selections.
And that's an interesting point I hadn't thought of, is if you're targeting well, so this company that you have built, the government knows you as a small business, and all of a sudden you're not anymore. And we talk about, you had that conversation with Shelley on the 8A program, that the same thing can happen to you, where you flip this wire and all of a sudden they can't treat you the same. But you're the same company.
Right. They want to come to you, but they can't do a set aside, or in that 8A case, they can't do a sole source anymore. You have to compete. So at this point, you've lost all the advantages in these competitions that you had as a result of your small business status. You didn't have to compete with large businesses that have the scale and the experience and all that. And that could be a real problem. The hardest part for me, the hardest part for me at this point was overnight, suddenly your accounting and financials and pricing, all that stuff just became so much more complicated. Because as a small business, you don't have to have approved systems for any of this stuff. But as a large business, you're expected to have an approved accounting system, an approved procurement system, approved subcontracting system. You're expected to be able to create forward pricing projections for your indirect rates overnight. You're the same company you just were yesterday, but now suddenly you have to have all this stuff in place. If you haven't planned for that, you could be in for a world of hurt. And in the DoD world, but this is what I ran into, DCMA and DCAA have to be there to approve your systems and do these reviews, which can be quite time-consuming. There are not enough DCMA and DCAA employees to serve all the companies that need these systems approved. So you have to get in line. And rightfully, those agencies are focusing on the biggest contractors and the biggest issues. So it can be next to impossible to get their attention to get yourself approved. But all the contracting officers like you, Kevin, were expecting that you're approved, and I'm not going to award to you unless you have an approved system. And you're sitting there as a small, large business going, I would love to be approved. Please, somebody come approve me. I've done everything I need to be approved. Just no one's come and told me I'm approved yet. It can be very frustrating.
And the reality is you have 50 employees or 51, and there's a company that has 5,000 employees who has to be approved first.
Or 50,000, right? It's
there you go. Yeah.
If I was the government, I would do exactly that. I would focus on the biggest risks first, and that's where the biggest money is, not on the little guys. But it's frustrating because you're a large business, but you're a little guy. It's like we're saying small, large, mid. This mid-sized business thing, this is you and I describing the difference. The government still has that line of large and small. Maybe we can get them to start thinking about mid or small, large. Wouldn't that be great if there was a small, large business administration?
Careful what we're going to make government bigger. That's necessarily what our goal is here. And something else to consider here is this could create, ironically, this could create a revenue cliff. And again, you and Shelley talked about that in the 8A program, where it's the expectation is you got this advantage, and then once the advantage turns off, and so it could be obvious. It's things like, okay, I can't bid on small business stuff anymore. But to your point, it can be more complex, where it's like you can't be competitive because you don't understand your systems well enough to be able to compete with Boeing. Right? Pick on Boeing. Right? That's really who you're competing with now. And it really, it's an ironic thing that what got you, it's that whole thing of what got you here won't get you there. What got you to be just barely over the line and make you a small, large business is different than what you need to keep going. And so understand that difference is huge.
We forgot to talk about acquisition time zones. And I think the reason we forgot is this mid-sized business thing, it follows both sides. It's all through all the acquisition time zones, through market research and how you write an RFP. It's all through the execution time zones, talking about performance and the recompete time, because you have to execute differently as a large business. You may be required to do some things that small businesses don't have to do during execution.
Well, one of them is have a small business subcontracting plan. It's one of many things.
Exactly.
Isn't that fun?
So this is a really important topic, I think, Kevin, because it's not black and white in the real world. It's black and white to the FAR and to the Small Business Administration. It's black and white to the government. You're small or you're large. But reality says there's lots of shades in between. It can be a really difficult place to transition. And we've mentioned it before. Some companies go back and forth between small and large year to year. If you're at 51 employees and a husband and wife that work for you move to the other side of the country, you're at 49. Ta-da, you're small again.
And as a contracting officer, I couldn't identify a large small versus a small large. I mean, or for that matter, a small from a large small. And that's fun to say, by the way. But this idea of how mature are you as a small business, I had no way of doing that.
I knew it existed. I mean, I knew that some of the businesses I was dealing with, they weren't Boeing. But I didn't understand the challenges that the system creates by treating larges as larges, regardless of the difference of the shades of gray in largeness.
Yeah, I guess let me say that. It isn't that I didn't have the ability to do it. I didn't think to ask.
Yep.
And so what we're saying here is, the government and industry need to be aware of this gap in here. And so an example would be a large IDIQ contract that is set aside for small businesses, and you see a lot of them, And the idea is, well, small businesses can do this, and it might be. Let's say it's a 200 employee contract that by the time they finish it, they'll be a large business. But the people who are competing on that, who I as the contracting officer want to see, are those mature small businesses. But what industry may be seeing is that, oh, it's a small business set aside. I can do this. And you get the company, instead of you want a company with 45 employees to bid. And the idea is they're going to grow out of being a small business through this contract. And that's a good thing. That is good. But what happens sometimes, if you don't differentiate between them, you end up with a 5-employee company saying, hey, it's a small business set aside. I can bid on this too. Yeah.
Yeah, and the last thing you want is
raising my hand. I've done that.
Well, and you could kill a company by if you awarded to a really, really micro company that this first big win took them over the threshold. They're not ready to be a large business, right? It might be the last contract they ever get, and you might not get your mission satisfied.
And they're out of their weight class.
There you go.
And they may not even know it. We're back to the weight class, which
right, because the weight classes are not just small and large. There's all kinds of weight classes. There's welterweight, there's bantamweight, super heavyweight. Let's get back to focusing on why the government should care about this so much. You were just talking about, do you want a really small or do you want a large small?
And you got to try to find out. I mean, so for example, you could do your market research to see, okay, how long has this company been in business? You can see what their revenue is. They have to certify to it anyway. You can ask, write an RFI and say, I need companies that have done this for, 5 years and have over 40 employees. Why not? Ask. And again, I never thought to do that. That's how you can.
Yeah, you can attract one kind of company and repel other kinds of companies just by asking questions and sharing what you really think is going to be required to do the work that you're soliciting.
As a CEO, I was painting with too broad of a brush and didn't realize it. I mean, we don't have to use tweezers and say like, okay, we need somebody that's got 17.6 employees. But at least let's be aware that there's a huge gulf. We all know, based on just listening through this, there's a huge gulf between large and small. And so let's try and find something in between there. And that's something I never thought to do as a CEO. And I think it's a huge opportunity to make government contracts better, one contract at a time.
The real impact that I didn't really see when I was on the government side, that I've really learned sort of the hard way, now that I spent more time on the industry side, is the government needs to do a better job of recognizing that these small, large businesses just aren't capable of some of the things that they're used to getting from the really big, large businesses. So proposal requirements, that's one thing. Some proposal requirements are written in a way that small, large companies just can't compete with the really large companies. And if you write your proposal that way, I'm talking about ISO 9 billion certifications or these in-depth pricing requirements and basis of estimate and all these things. If you write your RFP with those requirements, you may be ruling out a whole range of companies that just aren't there yet. They can do the work, but they don't have the rest of that infrastructure there, and they don't necessarily need it to do what you're asking for, but you're inadvertently knocking them out by requiring these things. You also have to understand that, and I already mentioned this, small, large businesses can't get magically approved overnight from a systems perspective, their accounting system and their procurement system, or forward pricing rates. Small, large businesses, they may be able to calculate rates, they may be able to project rates and submit them, but all they can do is submit their projections, a forward pricing rate proposal. The government may not ever negotiate and approve those rates, yet some COs require approved rates. And you'd say, I'd love to have approved rates. Somebody please approve them. Or at least disapprove them so we know something. But my point is, I didn't understand when I was on the government side that those things just don't magically happen.
Yeah, and it also applies to performance and to schedules, things that a large bit, or how about this, for proposals, to say, okay, just submit an alternate proposal. You know what? A really large company that has an army of proposal managers can do that. A small, large that has one proposal manager might not be able to.
And not the resources to hire anybody else, right?
Exactly. And so if it's what you need, it's what you need. I'm not saying this is always bad. I'm just thinking of understand that just because it's a large business set aside, otherwise known as full and open competition, if it's full and open, what do you really just want, the huge companies, or do you want the thousands that are in between?
So I've been whining about the problems that happen from the industry side, that you can't get your rates approved or whatever. But the reason I'm doing that is industry really needs to be conscious that crossing this threshold to being considered a large business by the government changes everything. Because only the government is considering you a large business when you go from 49 to 50 or whatever. You're not any different. You're not a large business. You don't gain all these capabilities just because you crossed this threshold that's been placed there. That's why some small companies purposefully stay small. They don't hire that 50th employee. They don't go over the revenue by $60,000 that triggers all this stuff. And they do that on purpose because they don't want to have to deal with it. And there's nothing wrong with that. So if you are a small company, don't underestimate the additional burdens placed on large businesses by the federal government.
Because remember, without the differentiator between small and large, you wouldn't be here in the first place in some cases. I mean, to be honest, if you came out of the gate just competing with Boeing, so there is
right.
a process behind this. But what happens sometimes, it's kind of like the conversation you and I had about sole source contracts, is everybody hates sole source contracts unless they get one.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the same. Everybody hates the small business set-asides once they stop being a small business. So don't be that guy, right?
Right.
And so be like, to your point, is be aware of this. This process is in place. It gave you the head start, but head start's over.
Yeah,
make sure you're aware.
And being just over that threshold is a terrible place to be because you're not big enough to compete with the bigs. That 50th employee didn't give you the opportunity. Yeah, that doesn't give you everything you need to compete with Boeing on this now, right? The compliance burdens that you now have as a large business make you less competitive against the small businesses that you were peers with yesterday. You were on a level playing field with all the other smalls yesterday, and now you aren't.
And likewise, when you were let's pick on one. You were a service disabled veteran-owned small business that the largest loved to team with, and now they don't want to team with you anymore.
Yeah, you helped their compliance with their small business goals yesterday. Now you don't. They'll find somebody else that does. So what I'm saying is, don't limp over a threshold if you can help it. Don't accidentally become a large business without prepping. You got to be prepared to leap over it. You have to hope that to get over that threshold, that you've also gained enough work, enough revenue that you can afford to do all the things that you now have to do as a large business. Hanging out just over the threshold is probably a recipe for disaster. Okay, let's wrap it up there before we get any deeper in this.
So think of the mid-sized business, this large, small, or small, large, as a third option. And again, I'm not suggesting we add this to the FAR. But the idea is government is focused on differentiating between a micro and mature small business and a brand new and mature large business. So when you say full and open, which one do you want? And so, and from an industry perspective, how does the government see you? If you're a micro small business and you want them to see you that way, then that's cool. That's part of your targeting. However, if you're a mature small business, you want to make sure they see that, right? So an example of how you can fix this is there was an RFP. I was talking to Rod Duke from Qualys Corporation, so one of the podcast listeners, and he mentioned, I asked this question, and he said that there was an RFP that came out, and it said, to be able to bid on this, you have to have had experience managing a $50 million contract before.
That's a great example of how the government can define what type of small business, what type of large business they think is required to get the work done. And it's actually there. By saying you have to have managed a $50 million contract before, they're helping to draw that line between those small, large businesses and those mid-sized businesses and the large businesses. And that's something from the industry side, you may not be able to tell what the government wants unless they help you draw those lines. That's a really good point. I've seen that before as well. Probably should be done more often. And usually during the RFI or draft RFP phase, long before the RFP is out, drop those numbers. And if a company says, well, I managed a $47 million contract, does that count? The government might say, yeah, you know what? You guys actually are really qualified. So we're going to change the RFP to say $47 million is the threshold so that you can compete as well. And we say that over and over and over again. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Is that thunder in the background?
That is. I live in Florida, man. It's summer. I've been trying to talk through it, but yeah, there's a thunderstorm rolling.
All right. I'll talk to you later. Take cover now.
All right. See you, Paul.
Okay, that's it for this refresher episode of the Contracting Officer Podcast. I must have been fully caffeinated when we recorded this one way back when. I'm practically yelling everything that I say. If you need help figuring out that threshold between small and mid-size and large business and the kind of things that you need to do in each stage, check out Skyway Acquisition at skywayacq.com, where you can build a relationship with a team of former contracting officers for advice and consulting help. Again, that's skywayacq.com or call us at 877-884-5280. We'll see you next week.